wanted to talk about a couple scenarios where customers try and cut corners, and it makes it a little bit of an awkward situation for me because I'm doing the work and it's not something that I would want to do. So, well, I'll give a couple cases. In this first case that I want to talk about, I was just supposed to do just the machine work on the compressor housing. This is probably like 3 years ago, and the turbo, the bearings were completely worn. The bearing housing and the shaft were all scarred up from debris. So this turbo needed all those parts replaced. The whole turbo just about needed replacement. Well, I was only supposed to do the machine work, and he provided a compressor wheel, but the compressor wheel shaft bore was originally too small, so the guy had drilled it out with a hand drill. So now the compressor wheel shaft bore was too big for the shaft, which means that it can move around. And usually if it can move around on the shaft, then it usually won't boost right. Like, it'll be so far out of balance because the wheel won't go in its same position every time you tighten the nut down. Well, when he wanted me to do the machining, see, I have to use the cartridge to check it to make sure it doesn't rub, but because the bearings were so loose, I have to check to see if it rubs, and it would rub abnormally because it had extra shaft play that it wasn't supposed to have. So because of that, then I have to machine it out bigger than it's supposed to be just so it doesn't hit the housings, because otherwise it looks like I didn't do my job right. So what ended up happening with this was that I ended up giving the guy a set of bearings for free, but the shaft and the bearing housing both still need to be replaced anyway. I did this for a customer of a customer. So, or I guess you could say the other guy has a business and he was doing it for a customer, and he told him about everything that I told him, and he decided that he would just tell him there's no warranty on it. It was just kind of an awkward situation because I can't do my job correctly if I know that I'm going to have to put this turbo together and machine a cover and know the fact that it's going to rub before you even put it on the car because the clearances are not right. And another case I want to talk about was the guy that called me. He decided he wanted to do the BMW N54 turbo upgrade, but it was for a BMW X6, and they have different compressor housings. So the inlets on the compressor housings are plastic, and so because of that, I can't do the upgrade on it unless I came up with some creative thinking on how to redo the intake, but I don't know how it was set up on that car. So it went from paying over $1,000 for doing a upgrade and rebuild to just doing the upgrade and rebuild for $650 to I just want to do just the wastegate repair. Well, the problem, or I guess the concern with this is the fact that you have to pay the mechanic $1,500 to take the turbos off and put them back on, and that you don't want to rebuild the turbos when you already have them off, and it's only going to cost you an extra $350 in comparison to what it would cost to get a new one. Like, I'm still saving the guy $1,000 on doing a rebuild rather than buying another set. Anyway, he wanted to do just the wastegate repair. I had already taken those completely apart, and the bearings were all mixed up and everything. And this was he changed his mind midway through the build. I had already planned on doing the rebuild on the turbos as well as the wastegate repair. I guess it's a tough scenario what to do there. So I ended up just rebuilding the turbos for free, though I didn't tell him that, and he just paid me for the wastegate repair. The reason I did that is because I didn't want to have to go back and redo this job for this customer, because he was too cheap to pay for the extra money to do something when I basically had already done the work anyway. The only thing I had to do was put it back together with the repair parts and clean it up, or clean it then assemble it. Another case I wanted to talk about was when this guy had a turbine shaft that he sent in for balancing. Well, he sent the shaft with the compressor wheel. The shaft was too worn out, and I wouldn't recommend using it. In some cases you can get away with it if it's got some light scratches, but in this case I didn't feel comfortable using it. I mean, you can mic it out and kind of get an idea of how much tolerance is gone, And his response was, see, he just wanted me to just do balancing. I had a shaft that I could have sold him that was a used shaft for a decent deal, but he didn't want to do that. See, yeah, so his response was that he claimed he used shafts that looked a lot worse than that, and that it worked fine. Well, the reason I laugh at that is because I had a scenario when I first started, and this was probably about 7 years ago, about a year into the business, and I tried to save a shaft or just clean it up, see if it would work, because I didn't have a way to get replacements at the time, and I was just in a tight spot. I figured, well, maybe it'll work, but the problem I ran into there was the reason the shaft to bearing clearance is so important is because the bearing spins at half the speed of the shaft, and in order for it to spin at half the speed of the shaft, it has to have that tolerance of how close the bearing is to the shaft in order for the shaft to spin the bearing. And if it doesn't spin the bearing, then the bearing will get stuck in a position where, or it could get stuck in a position where the oil isn't going to the inside of the shaft, which will accelerate the wear on the turbine shaft and the bearing. That lasted 4,000 miles before the guy noticed it had a problem. It was smoking and things like that. I ended up rebuilding that guy's turbo again, replacing the parts, and we upgraded it again from a 16G to a 20G. But I mean, that's just kind of an example. When you try and save money, down the road it can go bad, so you may as well just build it like as if it's a new turbo. Especially if you own a rebuild shop, you may as well give the customer 100% of what they're paying for, because they don't want to have to go and remove the turbos again to be repaired, because that costs them even more money and then can also damage your reputation as a turbo builder. One case I want to talk about is somebody that wanted to do the BMW N54 rebuild and upgrade. And I did this build 3 times. The first time it lasted 6 months. There was nothing that I did that was wrong about the build. It just seemed like what happened was the rear seal had worn out, probably because the guy didn't change his oil or use thick enough oil. I'm just guessing that's what happened, because I don't see that very often. I've only seen it in about 2 cases, and his being one. The other thing that happened after that, he sends back the set, but he wants them back so quickly. When I got them back, we turned them around in like a day, and I had one of my employees do the work. And when so this was the second time. The second time that he received them, we turned them around quickly, got them to him, and he said that they were leaking oil or something, so I found that hard to believe. He sent them back, and I think what happened with that is, I think that for some reason my employee didn't put the piston ring seal on the front or something. Went back through them and rebuilt them again, and what had happened at that point was we did everything like we were supposed to. Everything was correct, but when this guy went to put them on his car, he used RTV gasket, or the silicone, to put on the O-rings rather than replacing the O-rings. The O-rings you can get from ECS Tuning for $1 each, but the issue with that is the time frame of getting them and shipping. You can probably get some that will work at your local hardware store if you really wanted to. But this guy was more along the lines of, it's his daily driver and it has to be done tonight, even though there's no stores open to get what he needs to properly fix the vehicle. If he had just left the O-rings on there and not applied the silicone, the turbos would have been working perfectly fine. But what he did was he put silicone on the oil feed O-ring. The silicone ended up going inside of the turbo and blocking up the thrust bearing, causing an immediate thrust bearing failure. This was not my fault at all, because he applied the silicone, and yet he returns them again. And then the last time, so he had already repaired them and shipped them 3 times. The last time he decided that he just wanted a refund. At that point, for me, I just kind of wanted to be over with this situation, even though he didn't believe that it was his fault for making them go bad. Because if he's that cheap to not replace the O-rings, then it's not a good idea for me to invest my time and my money to pay people to work on stuff to be able to trust that he's going to do his job right, so that I don't have to have it come back and warranty it for free again. That was kind of like an extreme scenario where how cheap can you be over replacing a dollar O-ring when it can cost you 12 hours of work or 6 hours of work, however long it is, depending on which model you have. Some of them take a little bit longer to take the turbos off and put them back on. When you go through those, you need to replace those O-rings every time, just because you don't know when you pull that off or put it in that the O-ring isn't going to tear. When I did the turbos on my car, I would put the O-rings in, put the feed lines in the block, and then pull them back out to make sure that I didn't tear them. The reason I did that was because on mine, where it was a winter car up in New Jersey, it had a lot of corrosion near the oil drain tube. So the first time I put the O-ring in for the drain, it actually tore the O-ring. So then I pulled it out, took that O-ring off, replaced it, oiled it up again and put it in, and then pulled it back out to check it again. I think what I ended up having to do, I tore at least 2 O-rings. I ended up buying more, which cost a week of downtime every time I did that. But it's worth it because my car doesn't leak any oil. I don't have to worry about having to check my oil level. And it gives me that peace of mind that everything was done correctly. The O-rings that I tore are $6 a piece. I don't mind spending $12 and waiting 2 weeks to have the job done correctly, rather than worrying every single day to have to check my oil level to make sure that there's enough oil in the vehicle that isn't being poured out all over the streets all the time and having to continuously add oil in my vehicle. I'd rather spend that extra time and money to ensure that everything is done correctly. I think everyone that is watching this should agree that they'd rather do it that way too. That's all for this video. I hope you're able to learn that sometimes when you try and spend less money, it actually costs you more money in the long run and more frustration and more time.